Well, we're going to do a little bit different deal. You know, we've been showing these videos, kind of articulating the doubt that we're going to deal with in the sermon, and that's what we've been doing in this series. Well, we're kind of moving to a new section in the book, and where we're getting on to more kind of the more positive side of it. Positive's not the right word, but instead of responding to the doubts of the culture, we're saying here are some things that we can put forth about who God is and His existence. And so I thought, I kind of told you we're going to try to get one of these live skeptics on the stage. We've got one. This is my buddy Eric, and you've seen Eric if you've been around on the video. He grew a beard. He wanted to be like me, he said, and but he's been on the videos and it's been just way helpful. Eric, why don't you tell us how you first of all just how you kind of found out about the church and your experience, and then how we got to know each other maybe from there.
First of all, it's an honor to be here. Thanks, Darren, for having me.
Yeah, buddy.
This is quite a testament to the type of church that you have, that you're willing to reach out to a skeptic. How often would you have a skeptic sitting at the front of a church? I bet it hasn't been done in St. Louis. Maybe, it's. So anyway. Your question was how did I show up here? I wandered into your church. I have a habit once a year or so of going to a church. I have a blog that I write for, Dangerous Intersection, dangerousintersection.org, and I wrote a post about 2 years ago, I believe. It was called "How to Enjoy Going to Church: A Guide for Atheists." And what I had done is I'm a lawyer by trade. I do consumer law, and I was in Belleville, Illinois. After going to court one day, I wandered into the huge cathedral in Belleville, and I immensely enjoyed it, and I made that a habit. When I went to Belleville, I went to church afterwards, sat there with a pencil and paper, and I wrote ideas, and I found it a wonderful place to contemplate, so it's not unusual for me to go to a church. I drove by your church once, and I saw the sign. The sign is unique. To have a website as part of your sign, I came in. I thought, I'll just go and see what it's all about.
You had your bike gear on. You were riding your bike, I think, right? Isn't that the first time?
I'm fairly certain I came on a bicycle. I commute by bike quite a bit. So I came in, enjoyed the service. I have many differences. I won't exaggerate. I don't believe in the God of Christianity or the God described in the Bible more than I would believe in Zeus. But I admit that there's no way for me to disprove these things. And yet I do feel strong energy, and I feel responsible. I feel it's important that we be interconnected. We have a lot of problems to face in the world. I think people need to work together. I admire this church and many others for the role they play in bringing people together, giving them direction, giving them a place to meditate, inspiring them with the music, with the beautiful, the decoration here. It's wonderful. This is a beautiful place to be. So I came to the church. I wrote a post about the church, and I won't say pros and cons, but I found that there was much to like about this church, even though I did not believe in the particular beliefs. So, lo and behold, Darren writes a comment to the blog saying, hey, let's go to lunch. So we've gone to lunch a few times and had some wonderful conversations that led up to Darren asking me to sit for a video or a series, maybe we'll do other videos in the future, talking about various issues and maybe trying to turn the energy of not just the church but the community out toward problems that need to be solved. And I think there's, as we all would probably admit, there's a lot of work to do for all of us to work together. So I know this is meandering. I'm not one of those new atheists. I know you probably have all heard of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and others who are really shrill. I think that attitude does not work, even if you don't have a particular belief that agrees with various believers. But in the same way that being a very, I don't want to be insulting, but there's some fundamentalists who will tell me constantly that I'm about to go to hell because I don't believe what they believe. So I don't think either of those attitudes work. I think that we all reside upon a continuum of belief. I think that there's many believers who have doubts. I think there are many doubters who believe. And by that, I think that if you set aside the shrill atheists and look toward many of the other folks who have interesting things to say in this regard. One of the writers is Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, wonderful psychologist. He's an atheist. He loves the idea of the various types of cultures coming together and working together, perhaps needing each other. Einstein saw mystery in the universe, saw order in the universe, and what is the label he put on that? God. He doesn't believe in a God that listens or a God that understands, but he believes in God. He terms that belief that he has God. So I think that the reason I'm here is something that I feel very strongly. And I don't know if you'll see this articulated very often, certainly not in the media characterizations, oversimplifications of what I won't say an atheist is, but whatever it is that I am.
What are you? Say what you are.
I think the problem, and we talked about this, for you too, for you to choose labels. There's certain labels that you might find that would oversimplify and create a cartoon of what you do. And I think the same thing goes for me. So I made a career out of rejecting labels. Am I a theist? No, except perhaps in the sense that Einstein was a theist, that he saw order in the universe and it inspired him. Am I an agnostic? Well, I don't like that label. A lot of people think, agnostic, what does that mean? It means you need to think about it more and make up your mind. Am I an atheist? I don't like to use that term. As you probably all know, if you call yourself atheist in this world, as Kay Hagan, there was a congressional race on the East Coast. She was called an atheist by her opponent. And the reason that works for many people in this culture is because it means immoral, shrill, it means, selfish. It means a lot of things that I hope that I'm not. There's other terms out there too. There's ignostic, I-G-N-O-S-T-I-C, which, as I understand the term, means you tell me exactly what you mean by God, and then I will be able to respond to you better. But there's a number of labels and terms, and I find most of these to be somewhat unhelpful. So I don't know what I am. I chose the term skeptic when the reporter called for the Post-Dispatch. He said, what do you call yourself? And I said, I don't know. Why don't you call me a skeptic? Although that doesn't mean I distrust all belief in all things. Of course, I have a family. I love my children. I want to do good for my community. I want to serve my clients well. I have positive belief systems, but I don't know if any of those labels really capture that. So I don't know if that answers your question. That's probably the longest evasion you've heard in a long time.
No, that's good. I'm good at evading questions as well. Well, Eric, we're just so glad that you have kind of let us peek into your life a little bit, and obviously we're going to get you all those videos so you can see, so that you know we didn't cut up your words and make you say something you didn't actually say. But it is, kind of as we have set this series off, it is important for us that we have dialogue with folks who disagree with us. But as we have gotten to know each other, we agree on a lot. We agree on the fact that our city is in desperate need of people to take the problems seriously that are hurting this city. And, we're talking about, Eric and I are talking about working together on some of the social issues. And you guys know, if you've been around the church a long time, we're not just about the sweet by and by. We're about the nasty now and now. And so Eric is concerned with that as well. And so that's the beautiful thing about the gospel. As I'm going to talk about tonight, the personal aspect of the gospel, but there's also a corporate aspect of the gospel where God not only saves people individually, he also is about renewing this material world. And Eric is very passionate, whether he realizes it or not, on that second aspect of the gospel. And so we can absolutely work together. So he's going to hang out and listen to the sermon and try not to make faces at me. And but he's going to be here. So if you guys want to meet him and talk to him and ask him questions, he's a smart guy. So be careful. But Eric, thank you so much for being here, brother.
Thank you, Darren.
Yeah. Take that in the bench with you. Okay. Well, we are getting on the other side of this series, as I said. And one of the things that we're trying to do, I've got this weird predicament that I'm in because I've got my pastor hat on, but I've also got my philosophy professor hat on. And especially tonight, I think honestly, this particular chapter that we're dealing with mainly, the chapter that Keller entitles Clues for God, I think is probably, in my opinion, the best chapter in the book in a lot of ways. And so I'm going to quote a lot from him and the sources that he used. And so forgive me, I'm going to sound a little bit lecturish, but I'm going to try to keep us engaged. And we're going to talk about the biblical text that was read a little bit at the beginning, but that's kind of where we're going. I want to start off with a quote that was actually in the New York Times, I believe, right before 9/11, 2001. Michael Wolff writes, "There's a fundamental schism in American cultural, political, and economic life. There's the quicker growing, economically vibrant, morally relativistic, urban-oriented, culturally adventuresome, sexually polymorphous, and ethnically diverse nation. And then there's the small town, nuclear family, religiously oriented, white-centric other America with its diminishing cultural and economic force. Two nations." And what we have said is, in this series, that both secular thought, skeptical thought, if you want to kind of take it in a defensive posture as a Christian, and also religious thought are growing exponentially. Almost all of the world religions are growing. Some of them, like Islam and Christianity, are exploding in growth, particularly outside of North America, but that's true statistically. And secular thought is growing. And so one of the things that we're doing in this series is to simply kind of educate us to that reality. I don't think religion's going away, and I don't think that secular thought is going away. And so in a lot of ways, just what Eric and I are trying to model in a sense, we've got to learn to be able to talk to each other, not lambast each other, and because there are some things we can do well together. And we're not going to agree. Eric and I do not agree. We've not even got into some of those hard discussions yet. We've got into a few, but I'm sure we'll get into a bunch. But the deal with he and I is we're friends, and that kind of equals the playing field a little bit. And I would just challenge you for you to think about that for yourself. Do you have any friends like that don't agree with you, that don't look like you do, smell like you do, think like you do? It seems to me when you look at the ministry of Jesus, he was around a lot of those kind of folks. That weren't like him. So let that be a challenge to you. My goal today is to show that belief in a personal God in general and the Christian God in specific is a very reasonable thing to do. Okay? So that's kind of where we're going with this. And with that, I want to recommend a website. There, in your bulletin, which I'm going to quote a few times from your bulletin, so you probably want to get that handy. I want you to see some of the quotes. There is a website in the resources. And in that, there's a guy, Alvin Plantinga, who's a brilliant apologetic professor type guy. And he has some good resources. For basically, he lists all the arguments for the existence of God and things of that nature, the best ones. And he's really thoughtful and he's very nuanced. And that could be very helpful for you as you're working through this for yourself, whether you're a skeptic or a believer. I'll start off by saying this, and I absolutely agree with what Eric said and what others have said, and that is that God is invisible. We even quoted the verse from 1 Peter. He's also unprovable. Okay? You can't prove, I don't believe, the existence of God. And I am all for scientific inquiry. I'm continually amazed at scientific discovery. But as we talked about last week, science can only go so far. Science can only go so far. Scientist Francis Collins says this in his book, The Language for God. We have this very solid conclusion that the universe began about 15 billion years ago with a big bang. It began with an unimaginably bright flash of energy from a very small point. That implies that before that, there was nothing. I can't imagine how nature, in this case the universe, could have created itself. And the very fact that the universe had a beginning implies that someone was able to begin it. And it seems to me that that someone or something had to be outside of nature. What Collins is trying to get through to us, and we'll pick him up a little bit later, is that the universe is contingent. It is dependent on something outside of itself. To use the nomenclature, something had to put the bang in the Big Bang, right? There had to be something that started it. And what Christian theology says is that a personal, three-person God, a triune God, created the world. And what this text says that was read to us is that God does not really need to be proven. He really needs to be discovered. That you're not going to find God with a high-powered microscope, that you're not going to find God with the Hubble Space Telescope, that you're going to really find God when you open up your eyes and you open up your heart. And that's what Paul is saying to us in Romans. This is Paul's evaluation, really, of the human race. Look at verse 19. Paul writes, "What can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." What Paul is saying is, God is the big E on the eye chart. You can't miss him. And our main problem in discovering God is not empirical evidence or even unjust suffering that keeps us from understanding God. What keeps us from seeing God, according to Paul, is sin. That keeps us from seeing who God is. Paul's evaluation in this text, we've talked about this text so many times, is that we as human beings literally exchange our object of worship. And we take things in creation and worship them as the creator, which causes us to miss who God is. That we take created things and we inflate them to function literally as a substitute for God. We take good things like our intellect, like our relationships, like our careers, like our hobbies. And we take those things and we make them ultimate. And those things we begin to worship. Even if we don't say we're worshipers, we begin to give our time and our attention and our money and our focus to those things in a disproportionate way. And when we do that, we get distracted from the one true God. That is what I think Paul is saying. And we commit the most warned about sin in the Bible, idolatry. Keep reading with me in verse 21. Romans 1:21. "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles." Paul's saying, listen, on a pagan level, and he's primarily speaking to that, where people worship the sun, the moon, the stars, and the trees, but on a principle level, what Paul is saying is, we take good things in creation, created things, and we make them our primary significance, our central identity. And when we do that, we get distracted and we miss the one and true God. And when we understand what we're doing, we can turn from that and we can begin to understand that there is a personal God. He made the world. And when we get that, we can give him the glory that he deserves, and then we get the joy that we desire. That's ultimately the message of the Scripture. Paul's summing it up here in our text. So just a wrap up of the text before I put my philosophy professor hat on tonight. We intuitively know that God is God. We suppress that truth. That's what verse 18 says. We take things in creation and worship them in the place of God. Our hearts grow dark and hard because of this, but God continually shows himself to us because he's merciful. In verse 20, throw some seminary on you here. The words in verse 20, if you look at them, have been clearly perceived. You see that? Have been clearly perceived. Those are two Greek verbs. They're present passive participles. And what they're saying is this: the reality of God's nature and our obligations to him are continually present to us. What Christian theology teaches us is that God continues to present himself to us through various clues, not proofs. I would say, but clues. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through these clues, and we're going to define them, and we're going to dissect them. And if you have questions about them, you're going to be able to text message at the end of the message, and on Tuesday night we'll deal with your questions, because there is no way I can possibly do justice to all of these in the next 30 minutes. I'm going to do my best. You ready? Let's go. Clue number 1, that God exists. The anthropic principle. The anthropic principle. Now, basically, the anthropic principle says when we look at the world around us, it seems the universe is somehow designed to support life. And not even just in general. Let me throw some science at you. It's pretty interesting. The Earth's axis, as most of you know from school, unless you were asleep that day, that the Earth actually sits on an axis that's 23.5 degrees tilted toward the sun. Now, if you were able to tilt the Earth more towards the sun, even by a little bit, we would all burn up. If you were able to tilt it away from the sun, we would all freeze just a little bit. It's perfect in its design. Some things about oxygen. If the ratio of carbon to oxygen had been slightly different than it is, none of us would be able to breathe the air. If the average distance between the stars were any greater, planets like the Earth would have never formed. If they were any smaller, the planetary orbits designed and necessary for life would have not occurred. Francis Collins, who we mentioned earlier, says, when you look from the perspective of a scientist at the universe, it looks as if it knew we were coming. There are 15 constants, the gravitational constant, various constants about the strong and the weak, nuclear force, etc., and they all have precise values. If any one of these constants was off by even 1 part in a million, or in some cases by 1 part in a million, the universe could have actually come to the point where we sit. Matter would have not been able to coalesce. There would have been no galaxy, no stars, no planet, no people. Keller calls it the cosmic welcome mat. The fine-tuning of the universe argument. And this clue for God's existence points to the external creation that seems perfectly designed for life to survive and to thrive. Clue number 2, the transcendence of beauty. This clue points to the internal reaction when we see beauty or perceive something that is beautiful. I remember my first trip to Colorado. If you've ever been to Colorado, you remember your first trip to Colorado. Because you can say you've been to mountains, maybe in the United States, and maybe you have if you've been up to Mount Rainier, but I mean, like, I'd only been to, like, the Smoky Mountains. No offense if you grew up there. But, 14,000-foot mountain. The first time I ever went to Colorado, I actually climbed a 14,000-foot mountain. I almost climbed a 14,000-foot mountain. I just stood there half the time. That's why I didn't climb the stupid mountain, because I kept looking at everything instead of walking. The snow was like this deep. I had no business being there my first time, but my friend got me into it. That's another sermon. But I was just in awe of the beauty. I couldn't quite put it in a category. The first time I went to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, my arty buddy, remember I'm a jock? My arty buddy was like, you got to go. I'm like, I want to go to the park. I want to go to something. And he's like, no, you got to go. So I went, and when I went, I didn't want to go, but when I went, I didn't want to leave. Remember the first time you ever went to the Basilica? Have you got to do that yet? First time I went to the Basilica, and every time I've gone to the Basilica, I don't want to speak when I go in there. I'm afraid to talk. It's so majestic and awesome. What is that? Why the reaction? Music. There's just something about music that stirs the soul. Beethoven turned out pieces of breathtaking rightness. Rightness, that's the word. When you get the feeling that whatever note succeeds the last is the only possible note that can rightly happen at that instance, in that context, then chances are you're listening to Beethoven. Our boy has the real goods, the stuff from heaven, the power to make you feel at the finish something is right in the world. There's something that checks throughout, that follows its own law consistently, something we can trust, something that will never let us down. What Leonard Bernstein is talking about is beauty. Beauty. What I saw in Colorado, beauty. Keller has an interesting quote. Take your bulletin out and look at it with your own eyes. He writes about beauty. Doesn't the unfulfillable longing evoked by beauty qualify as an innate desire? We have a longing for joy and love and beauty that no amount of or quality of food or sex or friendship or success can satisfy. We want something that nothing in this world can fulfill. Isn't that at least a clue that this something that we want exists? This unfulfillable longing then qualifies as a deep, innate human desire that makes it a major clue that God is here. See, beauty, whether it's non-human creations like mountains and oceans and canyons, or human creations like music and art, seem to take us beyond the realm of the natural. One time my wife and I were on the beach in the Pacific Ocean watching, and all of a sudden we see these fins come out of the water and going across, and people are swimming. I thought they were sharks. So I start to get freaked out, but then I notice that no one else is freaked out. And I'm like, I'm the pale guy from the Midwest, so if they're not freaking out, maybe it's, oh, my wife's like, it's dolphins, dummy. All right, okay, it's dolphins. So I found out it's a pod. That's what they're called, I think, when they go together. There was like 5 of them. And they were just going back and forth. And I was sitting there watching those for, I don't know, hours. I couldn't take my eyes off these beautiful animals. And it's the sense that I wasn't alone, that there was something bigger than me, that they were beautiful, but that they were pointing to something that was more beautiful. I think beauty is a clue that God is there. Clue number 3. I think this is probably the most powerful one from a philosophical mindset, the moral obligation. See, whether you're a layperson or a philosopher, kind of the main response or reaction to our pluralistic world, and by the way, you have to respond some way to our pluralistic world. You either hunker down in your fundamentals, whatever those are, and you treat everybody else who doesn't believe like you like the enemy, or you try to resolve that, you try to deal with that. There's ways to try to, well, one of the ways that people have done this is relativism. It's very popular. My guess is that many of you listening to me would hold to this philosophy, whether you would acknowledge it or not, and relativism goes something like this: all truth is personal and not universal. You have your truth, I have my truth. Therefore, because truth is personal and not objective, no one has the right to push their truth onto you, nor you onto them. That's relativism. And it's just common sense in our culture, right? We dealt with this, I think, in the first week of the series. Here's the problem. Even if you philosophically believe it and even expound it with your lips, you are not a consistent relativist. No one is. This is a problem. You might say, most people think, but they don't say, but you might even be bold enough to say, everyone can come to their own conclusions about what is right and wrong. But there is something that you will and do impose on other people because you believe it is true for all peoples, in all places, and for all times. Everyone does. Every human being has something called a standard that they demand externally or internally that others adopt regardless of that other person's convictions. Why do we do this? Why are we inconsistent with our relativistic views? Well, could it be that the reason is it's because there are not just moral values that come from without, human cultures created them? Could it be that there are actually moral obligations that come from within because God has put it there? Sociologist Christian Smith, also a quote in your bulletin. Take a look at it. He puts it like this: moral is an orientation toward understanding about what is right and wrong, just and unjust, that are not established by our own actual desires or preferences, but instead they are believed to exist apart from them, providing standards by which our desires and preferences can themselves be judged. And so what he's saying is that there is a morality that exists apart from us. He's arguing, in a sense, against relativism. Keller says it like this, I think brilliantly. He says, all human beings have moral feelings. We call it a conscience. When considering doing something we feel to be wrong, we tend to refrain. Our moral sense does not stop there, however. We also believe that there are standards that exist apart from us, by which we evaluate moral feelings. Moral obligation is a belief that some things ought not to be done, regardless of how a person feels about them within herself, regardless of what the rest of her community and culture says, and regardless of whether it is in her self-interest or not. Relativism works really well with your friends and your family and your own culture. It actually works pretty well. But when you go to another culture, you suddenly have to deal with some issues. And the example that I want to point to is a little graphic, but I think it's apropos. I read an article years ago. I hate it that I didn't capture it and know exactly where to source it. But there was an anthropologist. She was not a religious person as far as I knew. She came into a certain tribe in Africa where she found that the women had their clitorises mutilated so that they would not enjoy the sexual experience. And this was a custom in this culture. And she found herself kind of in the middle of this. It surprised her. Well, she being very much an advocate of letting cultures develop on their own, not imposing Western, views upon those cultures, on the one hand, but on the other hand, being a woman who was very passionate about women's rights, let's just say she was a little conflicted. And she was writing and saying, I have a conflict. It is not right for these women, but who am I to? But wait a minute, I'm a woman and this isn't right, but who am I to? See, we're caught as relativists in things like that. And I know it's popular, and I know it's seemingly tolerant and inclusive to believe that moral values are all relative, but friends, no one lives that way. No one really lives that way. Specifically when it comes to real life situations like our friend who found herself in that tribal situation. We don't care, for instance, about the good intentions of the white segregationists in our country. We don't care about the nice and sincere ideals of Nazi Germany. They ought not to have done it. And this really bleeds into the fourth clue, which is the desire for human rights that human beings seem to have. Why do we consistently, and I think this is the one we really violate our relativistic values in, human rights. Why do we do that? We got to ask the question though first, where do human rights come from? Where do human rights come from? I got an email from some folks in the church after Jonathan taught last week, or actually Jonathan got the email and I received them, where there's been some study about trying to tie evolution, macroevolution to human rights. I know there's some studies being done. There's some things being proposed. I'm unconvinced by those arguments. I'm certainly not seen them all, but what I've seen, I'm not convinced of them. I think Keller's point in his book is especially brilliant here. I don't think we get human rights from evolution. Any of you guys ever read Annie Dillard? Okay, so Annie Dillard is serious about her poetry and her writing, so serious that she took a whole year and lived by a creek in the mountains to be inspired. She had writer's block, and so she wanted to be inspired. So she literally put herself down by a creek, and she said, I'm going to be inspired by nature. I'm going to watch what's going on. And this is what she writes about that experience. There is not a person in the world that behaves as badly as a praying mantis. But wait, you say there's no right or wrong in nature. Right and wrong is a human concept. Precisely, she says. We are moral creatures in an amoral world. Or consider the alternative. It is only human feeling that is freakishly amiss. It is our emotions that are askew. We are freaks. The world is fine. So, let us all go have lobotomies to restore us to our natural state. We can then leave, lobotomized, go back to the creek, and live on its banks as untroubled as a muskrat or a reed. And then she writes, you first. Keller, commenting on this, says, Anne Dillard saw that all of nature is based on violence. Yet we inescapably believe it is wrong for stronger humans to kill weaker ones. If violence is totally natural, why would it be wrong for strong humans to trample weak ones? There's no basis for moral obligation unless we argue that nature is in some part unnatural. We can't know that nature is broken in some way unless there is some supernatural standard of normacy apart from nature by which we can judge right and wrong. I don't think natural selection and human rights go together. I don't think you can draw from there. You can argue with me, but I've got the microphone tonight. Come on Tuesday night. I also don't think you can get to human rights from atheism. And as we've tried to establish, that you don't have to reject all of evolution as a Christian. And so I want to kind of cut those in half for a moment. I don't think you can get human rights, though, from a purely atheistic mindset. The late law professor from Yale, Arthur Leth, says it this way. This is also in your bulletin. I'd love for you to look at this with your eyes as well. He says, in the absence of God, each ethical and legal system will be differentiated by the answer it chooses to give to one key question. And that question is, who among us ought to be able to declare law that ought to be obeyed? Stated that badly, the question is so intellectually unsettling that one would expect to find a noticeable number of legal and ethical thinkers trying not to come to grips with it. Either God exists or he does not. But if he does not, nothing and no one else can take his place. Left's argument is that if there is no God, you cannot call one act immoral and another immoral, one action right and another one wrong. All you can say is, I prefer this act and not that one. He writes in here, if there is no God, there is no grand who says. We're all on our own. Well, Darren, that's nice. I know you're a pastor and you tend to be dramatic. But that's just too dramatic, and that is way too individualistic. We get our morality from the majority. Well, let me ask you a question. How moral was the majority in Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s? How moral was the majority in the United States in the 50s and 60s? How moral was the majority in South Africa in the 1980s? How moral was the majority in the Balkans in the 1990s? How moral is the majority right now in the Sudan? Let's go to white America back It's always easy for us to criticize other cultures. Let's criticize our own. Let's take some responsibility for our country back in the 50s and 60s. Was that wrong? Was segregation wrong? Was it wrong to make black people drink out of different water fountains and go to different bathrooms and sit in the back of the bus? Was that wrong? Well, you say, yeah, of course, it's wrong. Yes, of course. Who says? Why should your will be preferred over the majority of the white establishment? We have a problem, don't we? Leff basically says, if there is no God, all moral statements are arbitrary. And all moral values are subjective and internal. And there can be no external moral standards by which we judge a person's thoughts, their feelings, nor their actions. By the way, not a believer in a personal God. He ends his essay this way. Since there is no God, he writes, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. There is such a thing as evil. Altogether now, says who? God help us. What is he saying? I have no idea where human rights come from. They're just there. They're just there. I can't explain it. They're just there. Scripture tells us that we human beings did not create human rights or the conscience that tells us right and wrong. We didn't create it. We discover it. Because God put it there. His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. And I started this whole sermon saying that God is unprovable. And I fully believe that there are sincere non-theists or, agnostics or however you want to, categorize that. And I think Eric is one of those guys. I absolutely do. But I think there are a number of folks, call them skeptical, maybe they call themselves atheist, who would subscribe, if they were honest, with what Thomas Nagel said in a moment of, I think, unbelievable self-introspection. He says, it isn't just that I don't believe in God, it's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. The universe to be like what? Like what? What is he saying? A universe where there is a creator, and if you're not that, you don't get to be your own God. You have to submit. Dostoevsky, one of his characters through his book, The Possessed, said, if God does not exist, then I am God. C.S. Lewis, when he was giving the objections to Christianity, and as only he can do, he said there's basically three reasons why people do not adopt Christianity. He says there's a content issue. They just don't have enough information. They don't know the story, the narrative arc of the Bible. They don't get the gospel. They don't understand it. There's a coherence issue. They know some details of the story. Maybe they know the story, but they just haven't put it all together in their head. But then he says there's also a cost issue. And this is the one that keeps most people away. Because to be a Christian is to admit and to acknowledge that you're not God. And therefore, you have to submit your will, and you have to lose control of your life. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Christian theology says a personal God exists, and understanding that God helps you understand reality. Christian theology says we believe this because it makes the best sense of the world. That there is a God who created. And creation was good in the beginning, but it went bad because human beings basically said, God, no thanks, we want to be our own God. We want to do our own thing. We want to be the arbiter of our own truth. And God responded, though. There was a creation, there was a fall, but God responded with a plan of redemption where God took responsibility for his creation's sins. And Jesus literally absorbed the wrath of God for us, his anger at sin. And he started this little thing called the church, and the church is not just supposed to be a hideout place until Jesus comes back and rescues us, but literally the church is to be a part of God's restoration of this material world. It is heaven one day, but it's also mission right now. This is what the journey's about. That makes sense of the world to me, that sin is real, but God has created, and he just didn't let things spin out of control like the deistic view of God. He took responsibility for things that were wrong. And the justice of God and his wrath and anger for sin, and the mercy of God and his love for his prized creation, which is what we are, meet at the cross. Justice and mercy meet there at the cross. And that, for me, makes sense of this world, that we're not just an accidental container of atoms. We are made with purpose, and that purpose is to know and love the personal God who created us. And though the text says we suppress the truth, it continues to bear down upon us through beauty, through creation, through our conscience. All of those things tell us that God is. Now, as you know, we are a church that greatly, greatly values thinkers, greatly loves dissonance and discussion. So this is something you've got to wrestle with for yourself. But some of you, you've gone from wrestling to rebelling. And see, this is what Paul's speaking about in Romans 1, that there is a point by which human beings basically can't handle the truth. And so they suppress it and push it away. There's an honest wrestling. And then there's a rebellion that some folks get into. And I want to pray that that doesn't happen for you folks. That we are honest in our skepticism. That we take these arguments to the bone. That we wrestle with them. Some of us, this isn't an issue for us, but you know what? It's a big issue for your friends. Are you wrestling on their behalf? Or are you just content to be the little, Band-Aid Bible verse Christian who always has simplistic answers to complicated issues? What are you going to do with this? We must do something. I trust that God is going to speak to you about what to do. Let's pray together. Lord, I thank you for my friends, and thank you for the believers and skeptics among us. And I pray, God, that we would respond honestly. Again, as I stand here as a Christian pastor, I pray, God, that the Holy Spirit would woo, make clear, convict, and bring people to Jesus Christ. The God-man that we have taken at the center of our life, the one who forgives enemies, the one who hates self-righteousness, the one who loves broken people. That's who we're about. May we consider those of us who have had enough content, it makes sense. Oh God, may we wrestle with the cost of following Christ. Even as we respond corporately in a moment, even as we hear the gospel through the elements of communion, God, make us honest inquirers of you. We trust you to do that. Friends, take a moment and respond. Take some time to meditate, to pray on what you've heard. And in just a moment, we'll respond together corporately.